Hello? Good evening. How is everyone doing? Enjoying this beautiful sunny day? So, first of all, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate your attendance. And for those of you who have friends at home that were unable to physically make it, please point them to the ACC Philosophy and Humanities stream website where they will be able to watch this event recorded. So I'm very pleased. I'm Azura Crispino, by the way. I'm the faculty advisor to the ACC Pen Pals to Prisoners Club, and I also teach in the philosophy department. For those of you who are interested in the Pen Pals, please come and see us in the back if you are interested in also writing letters to prisoners as an ACC student. And for those of you who came because your professors bribed you with extra credit, thank you to your professors. If they asked you to sign in, please make sure to sign in with the student sign-in sheet. There is also another sign-in sheet for those of you who are interested in getting more information about witness to mass incarceration. So 3 possible sign-in sheets. Just sign them all, right? And that way you'll make sure to get your extra credit and all the information that you need. It is my absolute honor and pleasure to introduce to you Ms. Evie Litwack today. I know that since you all came and saw the flyers that she needs really no introduction, but what is most heartwarming to me about the Witness to Mass Incarceration project is the idea of humanizing prisoners. Often we hear statistics, but we don't get to hear stories or see faces or really connect on a heart level with what many, many people in this country have faced or are currently facing in what we call the problem of mass incarceration. So I am very excited to introduce Ms. Evie Litwack and the Witness to Mass Incarceration Project. Please join me in giving her a warm welcome.
I just have to check. Oh, my mic is on. I'm good. Okay. So I want to thank Azura Crispino for inviting me, and I have a whole list of people to thank, so please bear with me, and I hope that I pronounce everybody's name correctly. Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Advocacy, Dr. Stephanie Hawley. The LGBT Equity Committee, Stephanie Vermillion. Peace and Conflict Studies, Dr. Shireen Karapur and Ramona Brown. Sociology and Social Work, Dr. Renison Lalji. Philosophy, Grant Potts and Miguel de Leon. Liberal Arts, Humanities, and Communications, Matthew Dowdy and Katie Leslie. And ACC Pen Pals, Alicia Dumler. I really hope I pronounced those names right. So I am a formerly incarcerated Jewish lesbian and the child of 2 survivors of the Holocaust. I say this because those intersections impacted me while I was incarcerated. My mother was 12 when she was in Auschwitz. My father went through 12 labor and concentration camp. I grew up through a lens, not of a Holocaust that ended May 1945, but I learned, it was a fluid experience for me, with them teaching me that whatever could happen to Jewish people could happen to other people, and that it was my obligation my entire life to make sure other people were taken care of anywhere in the world. And in 2009 and 2010, I was living with my mom, who was hard of hearing, couldn't really see too well, and couldn't walk too well. So I was her 24/7 caregiver, and she insisted on coming with me to my sentencing hearing, which was in 2010. I had lost my case earlier that year. And she wanted to talk to the judge, so I'm going to read you exactly what she said. Your Honor, I am a Holocaust survivor. I've suffered enough for a lifetime. My daughter, she's been a fantastic daughter. Without her, I cannot exist. She's been doing everything for me. She feeds me, she shops, and she repeats again, as far as I'm concerned, I can't exist without her, not even for a day, I will die. To which the judge said, your daughter is a monster and she's going to prison. And I was pretty furious, not because he called me a monster, but because he did it in front of my mother, which he did not have to do. Clearly, she was in a lot of pain. So when we got home, you unpack for prison. You don't pack for prison. You take off your jewelry, you put away your pocketbooks, you wear the least amount of clothes possible. And I was making lists of my mother's doctors, things that she needed, and she's about 4'9", really cute. If you go to YouTube under Evie Litwack, you'll see just my mother videos, which are adorable. Anyway, she walked in with her wheelchair, and she said, "I want to talk to you." Very serious, so I stood up, and she looked at me and said, "Prison is going to be harder for you than concentration camp was for me." And I looked at her, I said, "Are you crazy? You were in Auschwitz. How could you compare the two?" And she said, "I was 12 years old. You're 60. And it wasn't until I was in solitary years later that I remembered more of what she said, which was, I was a little girl, I was a child. You are an old woman, you had a whole life, and you're going to remember every day of that life, every day you are in prison." And she was correct. So the moment, excuse me, I came with a cold, forgive me. The moment you enter prison, you know you have left the free world. It doesn't take but the closing door at the prison gate when you walk in. I was taken into a cold and dingy room, and prison is a series of cold and dingy rooms. I was asked, I had to strip naked in front of a female officer. I had to pee in front of her. And then she asked me to lift my breasts so she could tell if I had any contraband underneath. And then she asked me to bend over and cough so she could check my anus and my vagina to make sure I didn't bring in any pills or medications. And in that 10 to 20 seconds when you're bent over in front of a stranger like that, for me, I was more humiliated than at any other time in my life. And in that 10 to 20 seconds, you want to scream, you want to cry, and you realize you have to put every feeling that you have away for the rest of the time you're in prison. And you have to find a coping mechanism so that you don't show what you feel in any muscles of your faces, and you didn't have that coping zone when you walked in. This is someplace you have to go that's totally unfamiliar. So I was assigned to what's called an orientation unit, where most of the newbies go for about 2 weeks. But it was a peculiar unit to me because I was with other women in the holding cells that day, and this was pretty much an all-white unit. And of course, I realized that the white unit manager, who was very racist, was basically sending the black women and sending all the women of color to other units immediately without them having this peace and quiet unit for 2 weeks. So I walked in, and some of the veterans came over to me and said, "If you want to do easy time," now this is prison language, so I'm listening carefully. "If you want to do easy time, make sure no officer knows your name, and make sure the warden doesn't know your name." So here I am, a baby of the women's movement, gay rights movement, civil rights movement, an old practice activist, and there was absolutely no way I could leave that activism at the front gate. So it took about an hour or two for me to be completely on everybody's radar. And this is what happened. Women were walking, you're allowed to bring 25 pictures into prison. So women were walking over to me saying, "Are you married?" I'd say, "No." "Do you have a kid?" "No." Second woman, "Are you married?" "No." "Do you have a kid?" "No." So after about the fourth woman asked me that same question, I said, "I'm not going to go in the closet. I've been out 40 years. In fact, 40 years earlier, I came out to my mother, my progressive mother, who said to me, "If Hitler didn't kill me, you will," which I thought was the funniest. When she said that, I was laughing. I had to put my hands like this, and it's the title of a book I'm working on in her honor. So when the fifth person came over to me and said, "Are you married? Do you have a kid?" I said, "I'm not married. I don't have a kid. I'm a lesbian. And she said, can I see your 25 pictures? Well, I took out my 25 pictures, which were all of Allie, who's right here in the front, my little Maltese. And this woman screams, this old white lesbian brought 25 pictures of her dog. Inmate.com took over, and within 1 hour, 2 hours tops, all 1,300 women, every officer, the warden, everybody knew my name. And they knew I had 25 pictures of a white dog. This turned out to be very dangerous for me. There were other lesbians, but they weren't they didn't come out. So much for being under the radar. And prior to my incarceration, and I went into prison at 60, I'm Jewish and I hadn't gone to synagogue probably in 45 years. I went during very high holidays with my father, but once I walked into prison on day 2, for some reason, I don't know, I needed a prayer book. And I found a fellow prisoner to give me a prayer book. And I found myself saying one Jewish prayer over and over and over again, the Shema. And you don't know where this stuff comes from, but it helps you to survive. In other words, you may or may not, you never know in prison what it is that's going to come out that's going to help you to survive. For me, saying the Shema over and over and over every day helped me. Within 10 days of being in prison, the very white racist unit manager called me up to her office. And I thought, I'm only here 10 days. What could I have possibly done to be called to the unit manager? Sets me down, and she said, it's come to my attention that you're an open lesbian. I said, I'm also an open feminist and an open Jew. That didn't work out quite the way I planned it. And she said, it's also come to my attention that women have been complaining that you're touching their buttocks. So I'm a New York City Jew. I know what an ass is. I know what a tuchus is. Took me a second to figure out buttocks was also the same. And I looked at her and I went crazy. I forgot that she was an officer. And I said, are you out of your mind? I want those women who said that to you right here, right now. I demanded like a court hearing, forgetting that I'm in prison. And she didn't pay any attention to me. I'm screaming at her, and she said, you can go now. By the time I walked from her office, which would be like, let's say there was a staircase to the second level here, down to a bed that was over here, very short distance, my bed was already packed up, and she had sent me out of this quiet unit to the ghetto. But that wasn't the end of what was to be my punishment. In prison, the ceiling is pretty low, and the lights are all fluorescent intentionally because it brings out all the predispositions you have for seizures and headaches, and prison is a place of torture. Make no mistake, every prison is designed not to rehabilitate. It's a place of torture. So you have fluorescent lights on the top ceiling, and from here back, you are the sleeping unit. You are the 150 women in the sleeping unit. And at 11 o'clock, when the lights go out, your lights are all out. I'm standing in a spot that's called the bus stop, which is a punishment location right in front of the sleeping unit where they had 10 two-bunk beds on top of each other, so that if I were to step off of my bunk onto the floor at the same time the person across me did, we would be stepping on each other's feet. So I was put in there as punishment for being an open lesbian and told so. Now, right behind me was an ice machine that came crashing down every 20 minutes. And on either side of me were the bathrooms that 150 women were using to flush toilets and shower all night. So the bus stop is designed, A, you can't sleep from the fluorescent lights, B, you got the ice crashing, C, you've got women flushing toilets all night. There is no possible way to fall asleep. And the person in the top bunk is literally 3 feet from the fluorescent lights. So That's where they kept me the entire time I was in prison. And to make matters worse, I went into prison at 60. I had a heart condition. I'm disabled from my back. Prison knows this because you sit down at intake and tell them. So work detail for older people is supposed to be something like the chapel, some place where, excuse me, you can mop a floor and then sit down and read a book the rest of the day. But no, Evie was assigned landscaping. First prison I was in was Alderson, West Virginia, same as Martha Stewart, just not the same year. And by the way, there's no such thing as a cupcake camp. It was tougher than some of the medium security prisons. Don't ever believe when you hear the words country club that this prison is a country club, because I know no country club that has jail cells in them. So just remember that. So they gave me a broom, and they asked me to sweep giant rocks off the street. And I'm talking not little pebbles, rocks off the street. It's physically very demanding to sweep heavy rocks off the street. So I'd sweep them to the side of the road, and then as the trucks would come by, they would all come back to the road. So I went over to my boss and I said, now isn't this silly? If you really want to get away, if you really want to get rid of the rocks, why don't we just bring the crane and put all the rocks in there and move them? And he said, no, we created this job for you. So funny thing happened to me while I was sweeping the rocks. I thought of a story. I grew up in a home where we had dinner every Friday night, and after dinner we told stories. And I learned about the 70 people in my mother's life who I would never meet, her family, and the 40 people from my father's side of the family who also I would never meet. But in my mind, these were very real people and part of my family. So in 1939, when the Germans came into Poland, in my mother's town of Lodz, they took all the men, the businessmen and the religious leaders out for 3 weeks. And it included her father, my grandfather, who I never met. And last time she saw him, he had jet black hair, black beard, and was tall. And for 3 weeks, they beat these men. And when they brought them back, my grandfather was completely gray and bent over permanently. And to add to to make their dignity even worse, they asked them to sweep the streets in front of their wives and children. And as I was sweeping the streets in prison, I felt as though I was sweeping alongside my grandfather, who I had never met. And that was kind of a wild, wild feeling. So I was in prison. I was arrested in 1997. I didn't go to trial till 2009. I was convicted in 2009, went to prison 2010, and then my conviction was overturned. I had 4 counts, 3 counts of tax evasion, 1 count of mail fraud, and I'll tell you now, never ask a person who's formerly incarcerated what their crime is. I'll explain that after the session. And 2 of my counts were reversed, 1 was dismissed, and 1 count was vacated, meaning the government could still come back after me. Well, I was only one of 3 cases in 10 years where a conviction was overturned by the Second Circuit Court of New York. And my prosecutor was pissed, so of course he brought me back. And without any money, I knew I would face prison a second time. And what had happened to me is from 1998, from the time of my arrest, which was late 97, they offered me a plea deal, no jail time, from 1998 all the way through 2014, through both of my trials. And they would bring me have me come to Long Island from New Jersey, which is about a 3 to 5 hour ride, with or without traffic, one way. And they would put me in a small room with tall men wearing raincoats inside. And I thought, this is so weird. And these guys would say to me, if you don't plead guilty, we're going to go after your parents' money. And I honestly thought, this is madness. Wasn't intimidated by them. I wasn't scared of them. I thought, this is the fucking weirdest shit that I ever saw. Do you actually think you're gonna put on a bunch of raincoats, stick me in a small room, and I'm gonna be upset? Not a chance. I didn't plead guilty because I wasn't guilty. Because I had a forensic accountant look at my books, prepare tax returns, and give it to them. But unfortunately, they had given someone immunity who had stolen money from me, and they said, we gave her immunity, so you're going to prison. They knew I was innocent. And what I met in prison was 2,600 women, and I would tell you quite honestly, at least 2,000 of them were guilty of nothing, because I read their cases, not because they told me they were innocent. So they were very frustrated that they couldn't get a plea deal out of me. And they tried to do this. They did go after my parents' money. Then the next time they told me, we're going to put your parents in prison. That did bother me, but that also didn't happen. And I did a whole lot of homework before they would make that phone call, because my parents are both Holocaust survivors. But it's not unusual. I was in prison with a lot of mothers who took plea deals because the prosecutor came and said, your daughter's going to prison if you don't plead guilty. I have friends in prison who are guilty of nothing but took 10-year plea deals because they didn't want their child to have a mark on their record. And that was one of the most disturbing things and jarring things to my sensibility, or my sense of what is justice in America. And I have a completely different view of justice today than I did before I had any interaction with the entire justice community from beginning to end. So I went to prison the second time, and the one area in prison that you are free to make any choices is religion. You can be anything you want. You can change your religion anytime you want. We had Wiccans, we had people switching to be Native Americans so they could go into the sweat tents on Saturday, and they couldn't do anything about it. So there is I went to services on Friday night. There were, out of 10 women, 5 were Jewish, 5 were not. And 6 weeks before the Jewish holiday of Passover, women who have self-identified as Jewish get kosher for Passover food and permission to buy special food for the 8-day period of Passover. So on this sheet is chocolate-covered matzah, chocolate-covered macaroons, chocolate-covered everything. So 20 people are standing around me. I want in on this, you know, get me some of that, get me some of this. And everybody wants some of this food. You don't see this on a compound. So before this list comes out, 35 women converted to Judaism. and that wasn't the only reason. It was also because we had 2 nights of services, 5 hours each night, with no guards. And being in prison and not having to turn around and worry about what's going on for 5 hours is like 5 hours out of hell. So we had 10 hours, out of hell. So none of these women knew how to do the Hebrew and service in Hebrew. Only my friend Marika and I. So she said, start singing. We asked why this night is different from all other nights, and I sang it in Hebrew. After I sang it, the entire place clapped. And I looked at her, I said, they don't know this is a service. They think this is like a Broadway show, and I've just sang a melody. Anyway, it was wonderful, and after Passover, they converted to Muslim because Ramadan had great food. So there is no medical care in prison. They say there is, but there is not. And as an older person, here's typical care in prison. Every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday at 6:30 a.m., you could go online if you had an emergency. So if you had a broken foot, you had to wait from the day before to the next morning. And that put you on a list where you'd get a call back 10 days later. So if you had a broken foot, you had to go to work, and we had to wear steel-toed shoes in prison. we're not allowed to wear sneakers. So you had to wear a steel-toed shoe, which was breaking your foot more, and work, and you were lucky if you saw the doctor 10 days later. So we had a physician's assistant in both of the prisons that saw all of the women. And in this one prison where I was, this physician's assistant would say the same thing to whether you had cancer, a migraine, a broken foot, a cyst. He said the same thing to everybody. You're fat, walk on the track, drink water. So he did. I heard it myself. So a woman came in. Her name is Miriam Hernandez. She was deathly ill. She was clearly deathly ill. And he gave her the fat speech, and 2 weeks later, she dropped dead because her gallbladder burst. And I went crazy because a simple blood test that day would have told him she needed surgery and she would be alive today. She wasn't, so many people have died while I was in prison, and you never read a single story about it. There's absolutely no reporting on the number of deaths that we see. And I might add that as we sit here today, there is, with the exception of the state of Louisiana, which was forced into it, prisons do not evacuate incarcerated people. This is an issue Witness works on. Does not evacuate incarcerated people at any time for any reason. The only reason that Louisiana does it is after Katrina, bodies were floating out of prison, and the ACLU and the Human Rights Watch went in and did a report, and a lawyer from Southern Poverty Law Center, Schwartzman, I don't remember her first name, sued the prison, and the prison now removes people. So as we sit here today, Hurricane Michael is hitting Florida prisons, and I'm having people text me literally all day what they've heard about, because there's 150 facilities in and around that panhandle. And the governor admitted there was damage. But when they say damage, they say a little damage. But what they don't tell you is that floods don't discriminate, which means I don't care if you're in cement, I don't care if you're a mile high, the floods are gonna get into all your toilet water, the sewers are gonna back up, and all these people, no matter what floor they're in, are gonna be sitting in feces. It is as outrageous to me that we have the death penalty, that we have solitary confinement, and that we do not evacuate incarcerated people. And that the only reason we don't do it is, imagine the cost. The profitability of prison would evaporate if they had to even evacuate the 100,000 people in Florida once. So that's why it's not done. And if you hear people say, well, we want to shelter them in place. What the fuck is shelter in place? That means you want to keep them there and you don't give a damn about what happens to them. And if anybody is interested in that issue, make sure to either sign in or pick up both of my cards. So I had a website, Witness to Mass Incarceration, and I spent every day in my first prison and my second prison sitting with women, reading their cases and hearing their stories. And my mind was blown at some of these cases. For example, I met a young woman who's 20 years old from Tennessee, from a town from 3,000 people. Her mother sold meth, and she was in the car or in the house or on the phone or picked up a phone when her mother would do a deal. When they went to arrest her mother, they arrested 3 generations of this family. They arrested the grandparents, the aunts, the uncles, the sisters and brothers of the mother, the children. So they took an entire lineage. Because one person sold drugs, they took 27 people because they could. And they took everybody under the age of 16 and gave them to foster care. So those kids would never know their real family. Thankfully, Obama gave clemency to the woman I knew who was 20 years old and got a 20-year sentence, and she did 5 years, but the rest of her family is still in prison. Our prisons are filled with people who are criminalized, not people who committed crimes. There are some people who committed crimes, but it's such a small number that it's remarkable. So I spent my days, and they would watch me. because they considered me an agitator. And so I sent these articles by snail mail, because snail mail was the safest way not to get caught doing anything. They tended not to read outgoing mail, they tended to read ingoing mail. But on this day, and being this pissed, I wrote an article about what happened to Miriam Hernandez, and instead of emailing it, instead of snail mailing it, I emailed it. And within an hour of it being on my website, I was arrested, shackled, and told that, and I had a month more to do in prison and I was going to be released. They said they were going to keep me indefinitely, and they could, and they did. But only, thankfully, 7 weeks in solitary. Not thankfully 7 weeks in solitary, but it wasn't 3 years in solitary, which is the amount of time they could have kept me. So in solitary confinement is an American invention. It's a prison within a prison that's run by 4 or 5 people who answer to no one. And the people who work there get triple pay. So solitary is a place people want to work for extra money. It's also a place where you have more power over everybody. I was in solitary with about 60 women. And if you're under the impression that people who are put in solitary committed any violent crimes, I want to tell you to leave that impression out of the door, because I was with no one in solitary who had hit anybody. I was in solitary with 60 women who were there primarily for retaliation because they didn't have sex with an officer. And we spoke to each other in the 1 hour we had a day to learn how we got there. So I was in FCI Tallahassee, where I know, because I saw firsthand, that 20 of the 21 male officers were having sex with 4 to 6 women every day. It was such a out there, open thing, and just years earlier in 2006, the FBI came to arrest an officer at FCI Tallahassee, and there was a shootout, and the FBI officer and one of the officers to be arrested were killed, but the 5 other officers were convicted of crimes. So I'm in the same prison, and it's open season on everybody. And I think the women who had it the worst were the Hispanic women, because they were really afraid of being deported more quickly, and so they were more scared to open their mouths, and they went along. Not that anybody else went along, but here's how it happens, and here's why it's not picked up by any video camera or anything. 75% of the women in FCI Tallahassee are mothers. And unlike men's prisons where men will go on hunger strikes, women will do nothing, and I mean nothing, to jeopardize their ability to see their kids at their visits. So I couldn't get a riot together if I tried, and I tried. It's the truth. I tried to get people to go. They said, "Go away. I want to see my kids." So an officer comes over to a woman and whispers, "Do you want to see your kids this weekend?" And she says, "Yes." And he says, "Then I want a blowjob." And she has to say yes. If she says no, she's either going to solitary, and where you get no visits, or she's being sent from Florida, where her kids live, to Wisconsin, Waseca, which is 3,000 miles away, or worse yet, Dublin, FCI Dublin, which is in California. They don't send you to the other 5 Florida prisons. They send you so that your family, who's already poor and supporting you, has no ability to see you. So that was the bulk of the women that were in solitary with me. If the women agreed to have sex, it was just as difficult, because once you said yes one time, then that officer would call you on the loudspeaker and say, "So-and-so, come to the mailroom." And you would hear officers calling women at times when we were being counted. We get counted all day. But officers would pull out women during a count, and they would have sex for the half hour that the women were being counted, and they would say, "No, so-and-so's with me." So it's this giant cover-up that they all did together, and it all happened during the count period. One night, in my unit after 11 o'clock, an officer came in, and the woman who was directly across me, he said to her, "Come on out with me." He wasn't even hiding that he wanted to have sex with her. So in his hurry to have sex with her, he forgot to close the door, lock the door that separated the sleeping unit from his office, which was just outside of the sleeping unit. So, of course, 12 curious women followed them about a few minutes later, and they saw them fucking and went screaming back into the unit. So 150 people were now awake, and everybody knew what was going on and was trying to trot in and watch. So the next officer, who came in at 12 o'clock, immediately called the housekeeping crew and had them wipe down the desk and the floor so that there would be no evidence of what went on. And the next morning, when officers came in, these are your independent officers, and they're not, came in to review the situation, they took the 12 women who saw and the one woman who participated and put him in solitary. They took the officer. They did not suspend him. They just put him in the men's compound 100 feet down, where women on our compound went to work daily. So he was fine. To this day, I don't know what happened to this officer. But what I do know is that if the claim is discharged as not being believable, what the officer has been accused of doesn't follow him anywhere. Because I asked, what happens? And I know now that I'm outside, this same guy had to have 20 complaints, but they're nowhere to be found. Because if the complaints are dismissed as not reasonable, they are gone through the shredder, which is extremely upsetting. So they kept me in solitary for 7 weeks. You're strip searched, you're given a t-shirt, shorts, a jumpsuit, and one blanket. They keep solitary in the 50 degrees weather, which for me was freezing, and for everybody was freezing. You had your fluorescent lights, and I had to wear all the clothes I was wearing because I was freezing even with the blanket. And when I asked for a second blanket, they just said no. Now, for you to understand solitary, I'm going to ask everybody in this room to visualize something. I want you to visualize not the bathrooms here, but a bathroom in an apartment or home you grew up with, a small bathroom. Does everybody have an image of a small bathroom? So you are going to be able to sit on your toilet. Where your shower or your bath is a metal bed that has virtually a half an inch thing that can't be called a mattress, so you're sleeping on metal. There's no window. If you do have a window, it's covered. There's no medicine cabinet. So you can stand up, you can sit down, or you can sit on the bed. No cell phone, no laptop, no reading material, no writing, no crocheting, no nothing. How long do you, by a show of hands, does anybody think they could sit on their toilet for 24 hours? Does anybody think they can sit on their toilet doing nothing for 12 hours? Well, some people, when I got down to 3 hours in other parts of the country, I had a few wise guys, and I said, okay, I want your name, because I'm going to call you, and you're going in your bathroom. And I want you to be honest with me about how long you managed to stay there. And they were honest with me. They managed 20 minutes, and I asked them how they felt. They said they felt like they were going out of their mind. Now, we have 80,000 people in solitary confinement that we know of every day. We have 2.3 million people in prison. 500,000 of those people have been convicted of nothing. Many people of color, black young teenagers, arrested for jumping a turnstile in New York. We have a prison in Rikers that's all 8,000 people and 8,000 officers for people who've never been convicted of a crime. So when you put a 16-year-old kid who might have stolen a backpack in solitary confinement for 2 years, when he walks out after his case is dismissed, which is how most of these cases end up dismissed, he goes home. His name is Khalil Browder, and he hangs himself. You cannot put children in solitary confinement, and we do it in this country. We're doing it with immigration. And people should be violently angry that we do this because it's in your backyard. When I speak to Jewish audiences in synagogues, I say to them, in 1941, any of the Allies should have bombed the trains that led to Auschwitz. It would have saved 4 million people, but we never go that step. We tweak and we tweak and we tweak, but we never stop things. When we know that in Rwanda we have people killing each other, we do nothing when we can send troops in and stop the murder of 1 million people. And what I'm telling you is, as long as everybody in here does nothing but hear me tonight and never takes another action, you are also a bystander allowing people in Texas to be in solitary, to be treated in an inhumane fashion. And we need your help in this war to bring down, I need your help in this war to bring down this Herculean system of mass incarceration. We must do it. As human beings, we must stop it. And the last 40 years has shown us that reforming this is not the way to go. I am for blowing it up. I personally would like to blow up FCI Tallahassee. I don't care that it's on live TV, but we have to get permission to blow it up, and then I'll blow it up. So in solitary, my immediate reaction was high blood pressure, migraines, which I never had, and vertigo. The rooms were spinning, and all of it was a result of my high blood pressure. I was begging them to take my blood pressure. It took them 2 weeks to come in, and when they did, it was 200 over 100. And I said, I'm in stroke territory. I have heart disease on my mother's side, my father's side, and you know I have a problem. Please take me to the hospital, because I could have had a stroke. And he looked at me, and he laughed, which is the most annoying thing, and said, we get $75,000 on a life insurance policy if you're dead, so no, you're not going anywhere. Now, the thing that bothered me as much as that, was the sickness in the relationship between the officers and inmates everywhere. So when I'm in solitary, they gave me a roll of toilet paper. I've had 10 surgeries, including colon and stomach. And when I and I needed a second roll of toilet paper, and when I asked for one, the officer looked at me with a smile and said, wipe yourself. And he waited days to give me toilet paper. Now, this doesn't just happen in solitary. This happens in women's prisons. They don't give you tampons. To this day, we are still fighting. And even though the feds have made it a rule to give toilet paper and tampons, those of us who talk to people in prison know that it's not happening. So, but when you're in solitary, you have no one who can help you. You have no one who might have an extra roll that can give it to you. So it's a dynamic, the people who work there might be perfectly nice people outside the prison, but the moment they walk in and they have that kind of power, it's a dynamic that's very awful. You need social workers, you need psychologists, you need educators, you do not need correctional officers. My cellmate, 60 women, all 60 women were screaming, get me the fuck out of here, and not at the same time. And you were listening to women lose their mind. I was in a cell with a woman slightly older than me, and because she was in solitary, she couldn't see her husband every weekend, and she was banging her head against cement and bleeding. She was trying to commit suicide. Now, in order to survive solitary, you can't think about being in solitary. You have to go into a fantasy land and take your mind someplace else and force yourself to think about good memories. You have to otherwise your mind will eat itself up. So when I was forced to deal with her, I had to come back to being in solitary. So I had to stop her from committing committing suicide and keep talking to her so she didn't harm herself, but that put pressure on me, which was very difficult. Many women tried to commit suicide. You heard them hanging a sheet. Some committed suicide. You heard them committing suicide. Some were caught quickly, but many died. I didn't think about committing suicide, but I did think it would be really okay if I just didn't wake up the next day. I had had enough. I had had a good life, and I had had enough of prison. And this was too overwhelming. And I didn't die the next day. But when I was released, which was much harder than being in prison, I did, in my first year, I live in Manhattan, I would be standing in a corner, and what went through my head was just walk in front of the bus, because you can't get housing, you can't get a job, you can't get anything. It's just too much. And I understand perfectly well how people feel, because I was someone who had education and 30 years of work experience. I can't even imagine people with, most of the people in prison who had less resources than me, going through that every day. I can only imagine. So I was released almost directly from solitary. You're sent home on a bus, you're given $30, and I landed in Port Authority to no one, because my mother and I were close, but she's in assisted living and she can't be of help, and she was, my brother was long gone, and it had nothing to do with my case. I was homeless and penniless for 16 months. I now have a home, but I worked very hard from months to even 4 years after prison. I never got a job. I sent out 200 applications with a 30-year work history, and no one ever called me. People are not going to call an older convicted felon. To get a job for any of us requires that some of you who have access walk us into a job. Without being walked into a job, we're not getting jobs. I went to nonprofits that serve formerly incarcerated people. They gave me a hot meal, a resume, a 2-week employment course, and 3 construction jobs or, food service jobs. That's not helpful. These $18, $20 million reentry facilities don't meet the 3 basic needs we have: housing, jobs, and trauma. Because we are, nobody understands our trauma. They lump us in with everybody else. But from the moment you're arrested, when you lose your entire family and you lose your finances and you lose your world, to then going into prison, to then going into solitary, to then getting released, your mind is becoming more mentally unhealthy with each stage and each event. And nobody's examining this downwardly trending mental health. And then facing, I'm 67, if I can't do talks like this, then what am I going to do? Where am I going to go? So, can someone tell me the time? I want to make sure I'm okay on time. Okay. A friend ran into me who was a baby of the women's movement with me. I noticed that she must have had cancer. We walked over to say hi, and she said, I had breast cancer. And she said, where have you been? I said, in prison. And she said, are you able to get housing? This person saved my life. She got me housing. She got me a little room. She said, you will stabilize if you have that little room. She was 100% correct. Having a room with a key to walk in and out that was mine was probably the most important thing to have post-prison. But I only had a Social Security check, so I said to her, Social Security is going to pay the rent. How am I going to eat? How am I going to have a phone? How am I going to pay my health insurance? She said, don't worry about it. We'll find you money. When she realized there was no jobs coming my way, she sat me down and said, I'm going to give you $1,000 a month for a year so that you have ways to pay your bills and eat. Use that time to build witness to mass incarceration, speak, and do whatever you can. That person saved my life. So one message I will tell you is, don't let a day go by where you don't help another person. Giving someone a cup of coffee, giving someone a meal can mean the difference between their having faith and hope and their being suicidal. So if you go 2 weeks and you're studying and you're doing everything and you've not thought about helping another person, it's a mistake, because really you can save someone's life with a little bit of kindness. 2.3 million are in prison, and as I said, 500,000 have not been convicted of crimes. 6 million people are on supervised release. In this state, you have some terrible issues, and one of them that I'm just going to highlight is, and some of you may know this, and it's very disturbing to me, and it's another call to action that if you're interested in, you can join me. There's a young black woman with 3 children who finished a 3-year sentence for tax evasion that came home, and in 2016, her mother said to her, "Go vote for Hillary." She thought nothing of it, and she went down to vote. She wasn't in the register rolls, so she took the ballot, provisional ballot, filled it in, it was never counted, and then she was arrested for voter fraud. And she was convicted and given 5 years between the feds and state. It was a mistake. On the same day this prosecutor asked for 5 years for her, he asked for probation for a white gentleman who did electioneering to try to get himself into office, and that man got probation. This has to stop. This racism is real. This bias is in our system, and we have to be out there doing something. We need to get someone like Crystal Mason home. You know, if you make a mistake, it should be called a mistake. It shouldn't be 5 years in prison. She's got 3 young kids, and she should be home. And I'll do whatever it takes to get to, I'm hoping you sign on my mailing list or sign on through mobile app, because I'm going to have a call to action and say, people, flood the prosecutor's office. And when you're going to vote, don't just think about senators and congressmen. The county clerk is the person who decides how much time the voting booths are open. The county clerk in Texas has limited the amount of voting time. So it's up to you whether you want to keep him in office, hint, hint. The prosecutors run for office, the DAs run for office, the judges run for office. You want to help the formerly incarcerated people and their allies. If they've been in that position 20 years, they're no good. They've sent people to prison. Get someone new. And please vote, especially this election. Hang on, I want to see. So I'll just make a couple of more points. People often talk about the fact that there are a disproportional amount of people in color in prison. There are also a disproportional amount of LGBTQ in prison. There is 10 times, men self-identify at the 10% level, women self-identify at the 42% level as being queer. It's that high. So witness to mass incarceration, I interview formerly incarcerated people 4 to 6 hours. I'm going to show you in a minute a clip from Witness. I take portions of these videos, put them together, and I try to have an impact on audiences. I want people to understand sexual violence. I want people to understand hurricanes. So before I continue, is someone going to close the lights and put on the clip? Is anybody up there? It's loaded on the downstairs computer. Oh, so I'm supposed to do something? Okay. So can you turn the lights off, and I'll see if I can do this correctly? Yeah. Another project of Witness, just so you know, is the Suitcase Project. I am going to synagogues, asking them to raise $2,000. I'm going to synagogues because they're my home base. Ask them to raise $2,000 for a newly released person for a suitcase, so that the person can have a cell phone with minutes for a year, a laptop computer, an $800 gift certificate for clothes and shoes and toiletries. I left prison with nothing. I had the t-shirt on my back. I had no ability to buy anything. So I'm asking the synagogues not only to buy the suitcases, but to meet and greet the person so they don't get off the bus alone, to take them out for a meal, and to keep in touch with them and try to include them in their communities. And I'm hoping to do this in Austin, in Dallas, in New York, and everywhere. Because if I can get the first 10 or 20 of these suitcases raised, I can get some publicity, and I believe faith-based communities all over will participate. We need a way back in. We need friends. We need community. So this is a product of Witness. I'm leaving this up not to ask you to donate, but to ask you, if you're interested, to text this number to go on my mailing list. So at this point, I'm going to say thank you for being a terrific audience. And you have me for the next hour for questions, or as long as you like. So I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'd love your feedback if you had a reaction to this 5-minute video. Someone? Go ahead.
We need the person asking the question to speak into the mic, or it won't be recorded.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Becky. When you were in prison, did you encounter other trans people other than the trans woman that was in the video? And how were they treated? And were they misgendered, so forth?
During the time I was incarcerated, I did not meet any trans men who were in women's prisons, and of course I didn't meet any trans women who were in men's prisons, which is what happens. Since then, I work with a lot of trans women who were in men's prisons, trans men who are in women's prisons. So I know a great deal about the population. I would say to you that particularly trans people of color are the most at risk on a daily basis. They're the most at-risk group. And what's going on now in the last year with Jeff Sessions rolling back all the rights that we were beginning to get and had all the advances we had made. I mean, I spoke at Obama's White House in one of the last months as I was part of I was there to brief them on the criminalization of LGBT people in prison. So I met with the Department of Justice. I met with the people from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. These are fabulous people. Everybody who works, and the PREA people, fabulous people, all who want to do good work. But you're under an administration that will tie their hands. And this is the most horrible thing, because they're changing the language around trans people every day. Is Allie okay? She's okay.
When you had spoken about your release shortly...
Can you hold the microphone closer?
When you were speaking about your interrupted release surrounding the Mary Hernandez letter, you had said that they could keep you indefinitely. Why is it that they could do that?
Okay, so we have this lovely thing in America called probation and parole, which is a huge area that people need to work on. So you commit your crime, and now what they do is they've created a whole post-release system which keeps us enslaved to that system. So I had a friend who had an ankle monitor. I can tell you that is probably the worst thing. And it's anything that's profitable will be done by people. You have people lobbying congressmen and senators to get longer sentencing. I know people who have 2 lifetimes and 10 years probation. What, are they going to come back? So when I say they can keep you indefinitely, I had 3 years probation on a 2-year bid. They could have kept me for those 3 years, and they could have gone to the judge. My judge would have given me 10 more years. It's complete discretion of a subjective asshole. And we need to get them out of office one at a time. One at a time. I'm not expecting to blow up. I'm expecting to do things slowly and intentionally.
Do you believe that
Where?
Sorry. Do you believe that probation was designed to fail? Like when you're put on probation, that you're designed to fail?
I don't know what the need of probation is for anybody. You've served your time.
So you think that it's
I think
pointless?
there was no need for me to go pee in a cup after I spent 2 years in prison. I had no drug charge. I just had someone who made sure for 3 years I had to call and ask if I could visit my mother in New Jersey. And there were times I forgot. I'd be on the bus to New Jersey and remember, and this should probably not be on tape, but so what? I would forget. And then I would call and say, can't we do anything? I go to my mother every 2 weeks. Your probation officer determines everything. My friend was on probation, and she was not allowed to use a cell phone. Her daughter was with her one night, and her mother, the daughter's grandmother, was dying. So the daughter gave her mother the phone to her ear to say goodbye to her mother. My friend told her probation officer, because believe it or not, most of us are fairly honest people. She told the probation officer what she did. But she didn't have a long conversation. She said goodbye to her mother. Officer sent her back to prison for 6 months. You cannot give people that kind of power. They will abuse it. Anybody, all of you, if put in, everyone in this room, if put in a position of power, will end up being abusive because it's a dynamic that's hard not to be. If you say half the room will be Jewish and half the room will be Nazis, you'll last about a week before you'll kill each other. So no, in answer to your question, probation is for the feds, parole is for states, and usually parole is really lifetime. They really nail you and can be in control of you. And ankle monitors are the worst because they know when you pee. They know when you move from the kitchen to the bedroom. So that's where they're trending, which means we're going to have one person watching each of us all day. It's just to give somebody a job, and it's just to make Koch brothers richer.
First of all, I just want to say I'm sorry for what you went through. You're a brave, strong woman, and I'm angered by a lot of the stuff you're saying tonight. But the problem I'm having is, in a rigged game, how are we going to make a difference? You
have to accept the fact that it's look, I am a political junkie and have been since I'm 16 years old. And in the last 2 years, I found myself more stressed out than I have been in my entire life. If I go 3 hours without watching the news, I wonder if we still have a country. So, you have to know that it's always going to be rigged. Probably for the last 4,000 years, it's always been rigged. There are people who want money, and there are people who want power. The question is, how do you take it from them in small ways that make a difference? So I don't think what's happening here is any different than happened 1,000 years ago. I think if we look at history, we see Roman empires and we see slaves. But I do think that where we fail is in working together. Where we fail is that you have this group and this group and this group, and those groups have to network. If we do not network, and my idea of networking is me speaking to audiences like this and hoping that 5 to 10 people who not only join the mailing list, but who actually are interested and will make time. So it will never stop being rigged, but we could do better. As being a member of the women's movement, I saw how many egos got in the way of the revolution. As a member of I've been part of movements. We need a movement. And movements are slow things, and you have to build them together. There will always be people who want to be celebrities within those movements, but you can get around that. Let them be celebrities. But we need to do the work. And for me, it means having people involved in 50 states from universities. Now, with the synagogues, I do the suitcases, but with the universities, I want people to work on some of these issues.
And as a quick reminder, the ACC Pen Pals to Prisoners Club has their meeting, our meeting, at Highland from 5 to 6 tomorrow and every other Thursday. and there are postcards and letters for anybody who is interested in becoming a pen pal tonight. Also, if you have a question, if you could kindly raise your hand as other people are asking you questions so that I can get the mic over to you, that would be really great. Thank you.
First, I want to say that was a great talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for being here.
And your name?
Sam.
Okay, Sam.
I wanted to ask you a question about the Me Too movement. And as somebody who was wrongfully convicted and as someone who identifies as a feminist, this movement has made such huge waves, and I think has done so much good in bringing out a lot of dark things that have been kept under the rug and showing us how serious issues of sexual harassment, sexual assault are and have been and will continue to be until changes are made. One thing that I hear a lot that I'm starting to see on social media is that we always need to believe the accusation. And as someone who was wrongfully convicted, and this is something I personally struggle with, is of course I want to believe women, I want to do everything possible with these cases, but I also believe that anybody can be wrongfully accused of anything. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that subject.
All right. You have to believe the women. It's as simple as that. And I'll tell you why. Because as a 10-year-old, I had my father's friends put their arms around me and so that they could touch the side of my breast. And when I would go to my mother and tell her, she'd say, "You misunderstand." And then as a graduate student working on a PhD in psychology, I had 3 professors who were responsible for my orals, and one of them said to me, "You're going to sleep with me or you're not going to pass my orals." So I went to the other 2 professors, and they said, "He's not going to pass you." And I left graduate school, and he's still there. And that was 1978. My story is not, the same time I dropped out, 30 other women dropped out. These are, unfortunately, there's been my mother's generation would not deal with taking these issues seriously because they couldn't. And so many of us, particularly my age, experienced sexual harassment more times than I can. You heard nothing. If you think social media is a platform, come to my house. And just let me tell you the stories in my life or about when I was raped and how nobody believed me. It's every woman's story. And when Dr. Ford spoke, every woman was crying because she was speaking. When she said, "I'm 100% right," she was 100% right. I know it, and I know about trauma. There are a lot of things that I don't remember, but things like this I remember as if it were yesterday. They're so clear in my mind, but I can't remember other details. But I remember that moment in his office and what he said to me and the look on his face. I don't know which door I walked in. I don't know what hallway it was. I don't even know what building it was. But I know what happened in that room, and I know it destroyed my PhD. Try not to confuse accusations of arrest with Me Too. Try not to put in, is everybody being honest? Because you can't do that. Because the situation that happens to women is different. As far as arrest goes, that's a different story. And I believe that there are more criminals working in the justice system than there are people in prison. And I don't just believe that because I'm some airhead flake. I believe it because I spent 2 years reading cases of women, 2,000 cases, and I could not believe why these women were in prison. And we had 200,000 people in prison in 1971. We built this industry because it made people money. We lobbied senators to create longer sentences. As we stand here today, people are lobbying to build jails in parts of Texas you don't even know about. And as we stand here today, 10,000 children might be in tents on your border and without air conditioning, and if there's a hurricane, they could all be killed. So there's no Me Too movement inside prison. Because if you speak up, you're in trouble. So the only voice those women have or people like me on the outside. And believe me, I'll be a very strong voice. And my two friends, Zahara, who's my close friend. Now, she's a trans woman of color who was assaulted every day for the entire time she was in prison. And by that, I harassed, assaulted, or abused. Someone either tried to touch her under the guise of a strip search, or she was handled every single day. Zahara is a beautiful woman, and people grabbed her. And her life was interrupted. She was a 16-year-old girl, a trans woman who knew she wanted to start take hormones, hooked up with other trans women. They didn't know how to make money, so they stole a television from like Walmart. And they kept themselves going. So she got caught. She came out of prison 13 months later, tried for 6 months to find a job, but no one had ever told her how to get a job. She had lived with a dysfunctional mother. They were constantly being evicted. She didn't have my background and my privilege. So she had no idea how to make a living. So she eventually stole another TV, got caught, and ended up 5 years in prison. Today, she's on her way to law school. So instead of losing those 8 years, she's a brilliant woman, could have been a lawyer already. We have a lot of cases where should someone go to prison for 5 years for a television? I don't think so. And she knew to plead guilty because she knew that the all-white jury in southern Georgia would convict her, which is why she pled guilty. So every story that women tell about their harassment is unique but similar, and every story in prison is unique but similar. I hope I've answered your question.
Hi, my name's Oliver. Earlier, you mentioned a statement about the death penalty, and I was just wondering your opinion on it and whether you believe it's justified or not, or who it should stand for and who it shouldn't stand for.
I don't. One of my biggest heroes is Bryan Stevenson, and if you haven't read Just Mercy, read it. I do not believe in the death penalty. As Bryan Stevenson says, who are we to decide who to kill? I mean, there's no circumstances under which I would put anybody, kill anybody.
Instead of the death penalty, do you have any other solutions to where we should put serial killers or people who have done crimes like that?
How many of you are under the impression that most people in prison are serial killers? Do you know how many people are in prison for?
Yeah, I'm saying
Okay,
like serious
well, okay, so my attitude is no one has to be in prison, even as a serial killer, for their entire lives. Just look at Norway. Just pick up the 60 Minutes clip on how they directly deal with serial killers. They don't put them in cement cells. They give them apartments. They retrain them over 20 years. And understand something. A lot of people who commit murder at age 17 by age 40, they're adults. And they committed a crime when they were young and they were stupid. And as violent as that crime might be, they're not the same person anymore. They don't need to be in prison for the rest of their lives. They really get it, and they're really a different person. So we should not be incarcerating. If you spent time with a woman I know who's 57, and this is a Texas case, she was 17, she was being assaulted daily by her stepfather, so she ran away from home with 5 other 16 and 17-year-olds. And one of them decided to steal a car. The others didn't know that this person had a gun. And when he couldn't find the keys, he went into the apartment of the woman whose car it was and shot her. So these 5 kids were all in Texas. If there's a murder and you're there, it's felony murder. So all 5 of you are going to prison. No, I don't think that's right. I think this is a kid who was abused, who went to tag along and spent from age 17 to 57 in prison. And now, as a middle-aged person with no skills, will barely be able to survive out here and learn nothing for the decades she was in prison, because prison isn't oriented towards. Don't think because you get 1 or 2 classes that that's an education. Education is full-time, and you know it because you go to school full-time. So you can't go into these prison programs so they teach you a course. One course isn't going to make you educated enough. So what I would do with serial killers is follow Norway's model or anybody in the Netherlands model, which is retrain them. They're mentally ill. Don't think of them as much as serial killers as people who are seriously mentally ill, need a lot of treatment, and can be helped. There was one other thing, but I forgot it. If I remember it, over here? Oh,
What about
over there.
your stone?
Can you
your
talk a little louder into the?
What about your like the people that commit like really bad crimes? Because
Okay, let's.
stone cold murderers. I don't know. Like what is your thoughts on that? Yeah, like a Jeffrey Dahmer.
Well, I do believe I do believe 5% of the prison population cannot be let out.
Yeah. Is
that-
there a way
but-
to distinguish and separate?
I think you can distinguish someone who kills when they're young versus a serial killer, maybe. If someone is killing over a 20-year period, I think that's different. And I think those people but I still will call it a mental health problem and tell you they don't need to sleep on cement beds. They can have a mattress, they can have a television, and they still should be treated like a human being.
I always wonder if somebody committed a crime towards a relative or anything like that.
It's hard for me to hear you. Talk into the.
If
I have a
somebody
hearing.
murdered my relative or something, like,
Okay,
I
so-
would want them to suffer, but it's like I'm thinking different now since you're talking about this.
So here's the biggest liberal,
I have a different-
progressive dilemma in response to what you just said.
Right.
The LGBT community considers themselves progressive and works on shortening sentences. Yet when Matthew Shepard was killed 20 years ago, they wanted the people dead who killed young Matthew Shepard. And they went so far as to help create the hate law, which extended the amount of time somebody could be in prison. So the same people working to shorten sentences, when it hits home, wants you dead. And that is a philosophical dilemma that we have to come to grips with. Because there in New York, there are people who did a Brinks robbery back in the day. Many of them are out, a couple are still in, and they're seniors. But in Rockland County, the families of the 2 police officers who were killed, even though these were not the killers, will work very hard to keep them in prison. We have to evaluate why we need every ounce of blood from somebody. And we have to examine ourselves, whether we want to punish or whether we want to forgive, because I think that's the question. Do we have any forgiveness, or do we just want the punishment? And I think that's a real dilemma, but it's not, for the most part, everybody in prison. And people always ask me, like, there's really not a lot of serial killers of the 2.3 million. There's really probably 200,000 people out of that number that will have to be incarcerated because they will not do well in society. But that's all. Everybody else is just there to make money for someone. Where's the next?
Yes, ma'am. My name is Angela, and I am wondering how far we can go with this when we have a president that is going against women and, putting immigrants into cages away from their parents. These kids are not asking for, they don't know that their mother and father came over here illegally or anything like that. But we seem to be punishing, like, mass people, instead of doing something about people that rape people and, how do we get past that, when we have a president that's going, grabbing women and just saying all this bad stuff?
Well, let me just answer it. You work harder. That's why Donald Trump is not. I love President Obama, but he sent 3 million. He deported 3 million immigrants. It's not as different as you think it is. It's worse now, but it's not like it was really good before, because we were under Obama, who I love. We bombed countries that I would never bomb. The only thing we could do is make a commitment each person has to decide how much they're willing to commit their energy to making this planet a better place. And I say this planet because we could all get killed from climate change, not from our arrests. There are issues that are critical. And I'm just going to say this. I'm here 11 days. I've done 11 talks. I've spoken multiple times during the day. That's my commitment. What is yours? What are you willing to do, and what are you willing to commit to? I just want to remind people who might leave early, take both of my cards, and please sign in. But I really think it's about personal responsibility at this point. He's not the problem. There's a lot of hims that are the problem. So we need to vote. I mean, 14% of this country votes during midterms. Why in a country that's so free are 86% of this country sitting home? So it's on us. I don't point the finger at Trump. I use what he's doing to get angry and figure out how to get done what we need to get done. Because there are things we need to do. And yes, we need to help a bunch of people, but what you do is you pick your lane. So my lane is universities and my lane is synagogues. And my job, as I see it, is to educate people enough to upset them that they will get engaged. I will consider it a failure if everybody in this room walks out and thought my talk was interesting and never did a thing afterwards. Then that's on me. So I'm saying to you out loud, the answer to her question is in this room. It's all of us and what we choose to do. And even if you only spend 3 hours a week in an area that can be helpful, and if you don't know what area can be helpful, write to me or call me. I'll talk you through it. But pick an area that interests you. There's a lot of need in immigration. There's a lot of need in prison reform. There's a lot of need in getting out the vote. So between now and November, if you have a car, make sure that you take an elderly person to the voting machine. There's so many ways that you can use extra time, but don't be a 24-hour student. Donate 3 hours of your week.
Hi, my name is Liz.
Can you talk a little louder? I have a hearing.
Sorry. My name's Liz. At the start of your talk, you mentioned that afterwards you would explain that why you never ask an formerly incarcerated person what they were incarcerated for. I was just bringing you back to that.
Sure. That's always usually, that's among the first. There's several questions that get asked, and that's among the first. If you're asking a formerly incarcerated person what their crime was, then you're identifying them as their worst mistake, and you will remember what they did. Oh, they were a bank robber. No person is their worst crime. They're a sum total of their entire life. I was a concert pianist. I was a PhD candidate. I was also in prison. But if I say to people I was in prison, that's how they will identify me. So I don't want to shortchange them. I want them to have the benefit of their entire life's experience and not be held to a standard where they're their worst mistake.
Hi, my name is Cassie. I just wanted to say I'm really loving what you're doing. I'm all about it, and I really want to get involved. I just wanted to tell you about, I personally have a family member who has been incarcerated for about 20 years of his life, from the age of 18 to up until now, until he's 40. And so while he was in prison, he found himself becoming a part of a gang, and as pretty much a means of survival to not be abused. So would you say that, I mean, he's just a petty criminal, like never did anything besides stealing TVs or something like that. So would you say that the prison system is traumatizing people to the point that, you know, they go in not really being all that bad, and then they're all of a sudden becoming more hardened criminals because of the culture?
You don't become a hardened criminal. You become traumatized. Really note the difference, because you have to disassociate yourself to survive. For men, they have to join gangs, otherwise they will be sexually assaulted. And even if if they're self-identified gay men or if they're under the age of 25, they're going to get raped. And you never hear, I'm just saying this as an aside, I know many people who are in prison who came out at age 38 to 40 who've never once told me a story, but I know that they were raped inside prison. The way to get somebody, we need to use the governor's ability to pardon and clemency, which we rarely are organized and used. And if in fact he did petty crimes, there needs to be a movement to put pressure on every governor in the United States, because clemencies, Obama could have given out 20,000 clemencies, he only gave out 1,200. Right now, clemency, and for those of you who don't know, the governors can release incarcerated people either through pardoning or clemency, commuting their sentence or just letting them out. So if you have someone that's been inside prison, they've done a long enough time. And they'll need a lot of help coming out and need a lot of support. And as I say to a lot of people, I may look normal, I'm not. I am damaged, seriously damaged, emotionally, physically, psychologically. I function, but I'm damaged from that experience. I am never relaxed. I am always looking over my shoulder. I'm always waiting for the shoe to drop. I'm always expecting to be arrested any day. You live in that state of fear that you never get away from. People are lying if they tell you they don't live with the trauma for the rest of their lives, but some people need you. If they lie, then let it be, because that's what they need. There is a way to get people out. It's a long process. You have to get a petition. You have to get signatures. You use change.org or some other organization, Color of Change. But there are people, once 100,000 signatures, or that's a president, the governor is less, get on a governor's desk, they have to look at the case. And they might turn it, and parole boards, which are notoriously horrible, are being challenged across the country by formerly incarcerated people and their allies. So I'm not saying it's easy, but if you want to, that would be a great thing to do, to work to get him out. And there are people who you can ask. And first you get yourself educated about the parole system and how it works, and get educated about how many, you look up, there's a great website, which I just can't remember now. It's the only website of its kind that tells you by state how every governor has done their parole and pardons, and for the last 50 years. So you should look at that site or write to me and I'll try to figure out how to remember. But that's a project, that's a 5-year project. But if you save one life, that's a big thing.
Someone asked a question, I'm sorry, my name is Derek. Someone asked a question outside the room earlier, and it really got me to thinking, because lately, actually last night, I saw the most ludicrous article in the world. President Trump was meeting with Kanye West to talk about prison reform. Previously, he had talked to a group of ministers about prison reform, which I think that, personally myself, it's a talking point. It's really no clear, defined way to discuss prison reform. Just talk to some minority people and like, okay, we talked about it and we might do something about it. Internally, as people who witness, folks who understand when you peel all the layers back from the onion, the true situation is about profit, it's about money.
Sure.
The reason why we have all these prisons springing up around the United States, the reason why we have, you say 500,000, I say more.
Well, that's a known, I'm giving you a known number,
Okay.
But I will give it to you, there could be more.
People that are incarcerated that don't have real sentences, that have been incarcerated for practically no reason. It's all designed for profit. What is it really that we can do to stand against the green giant?
If you're asking, should Trump be someone who we fight in this period of time, or he's not relevant to anything I do. And I don't think he's relevant to. He meant profit. You're asking me about profit?
Yeah.
About.
The green giant being the dollar bill.
One solution that I gave earlier which is if you force the evacuation in the state of Texas, to move 100,000 people in the state of Texas would cost $2 billion, and that would remove the profit. So I try to think about solutions that are very costly, because that's their bottom line. But I do have a theory, and my theory is it's not a coincidence the state of Colorado was the first state to close solitary confinement, which is the most expensive form of confinement. It's no accident that Colorado was also the first state that started legalizing medical marijuana. Now, the reason is, your budget as it stands in every state, the state of Texas gets $50 million from one line item in prison, commissary, and I'll explain that. If there are 2.3 million people in prison, let's assume only half of them, or 1 million of them, can afford commissary. Commissary is what you need to survive because nobody can eat the food, and you need, they give you steel-toed shoes, a pair of pants, and a t-shirt. So to not freeze, you need to be able to buy sweatshirts, you need to buy sneakers, you need to buy shampoo, you need to buy all kinds of things, and $320 is not much money, but that's what we're allowed each month. If only 1 million people are spending that, that's $300 million a month, and it's $3.2 billion a year. That's just for commissary. So that's not for email, that's not for phone, that's not for JPay, that's not for visits. But out of the commissary money, the state of Texas gets $50 million, which it finds irreplaceable. But I do believe the more states that have marijuana, you will see a decrease in prison, because if they can replace those monies, they don't rely on it as much. That's just my theory, so I believe let's push marijuana legislation. We also have to put it in the hands of people of color, not white people. I'm very pragmatic when I think about these. I try to think largely how to have an impact, and I try to think how to have a one-person impact. So that's one way. The idea of going after private prisons and their stocks would just take too long. People are not going to take them out of their portfolios. I'm not against putting 10,000 people in front of a private prison and standing there until the prison closes. I'm not against that. I'm all for it. But I'm against 100 people standing in front of it, because 100 is going to do shit. But 10,000, they can't take away so easily. And those 10,000 need to be replaced by others as they get taken away, until people get the message that this prison is a disaster. So I'm all for, that's why you build networks. That's why I'm trying to build a mailing list, to have thousands of people, so I can communicate and say, can you get 100 people in Texas to write this letter? But it takes time, and it takes trust. Anybody else? Go ahead.
I know I already asked a question.
No, feel free, go right ahead, you have me.
A couple years ago, before Trump was elected, the justice system, or the Attorney General said that they were going to start working on closing ending the private prison
Correct.
industry. And that was as a result of an awesome investigative journalist piece. So obviously, investigative journalism is like a big hero
Very
in that
important.
situation. So the question I have is about, they announced that they were going to work toward closing private prisons, but they were going to continue having private detention centers for immigrants.
No, they reversed this.
Well, I know this is like not relevant anymore because the
Trump-
step forward has been taken away anyways, but I guess my question for you is how do we deal with the fact that immigrants are criminalized in this country, and people who are like asylum seekers and people who are only running for their lives are put into private prisons and profited off of?
Okay, so the policy of private prisons was rolled back in an executive order by Trump. I don't believe there should be there should be people focusing on immigration and not focusing on prison. They should be working together because the issues go hand in hand. And so that's what I mean by when you have people solely working in one area. All they're doing is replicating America's jails. Detention center are the new jails, and there are so many going up in the western states, the southwestern states. But you need to work with people all over the country who have listservs that feed in information. So today, when I wanted to know about what was going on with Hurricane Michael, I went on a listserv that is all formerly incarcerated women, and I instantly, within an hour, people were able to write to people inside or provide information. So listservs, getting on places, you have to be informed and you have to join groups that are working well together. The immigration problem is a nightmare because under the Patriot Act, you can hide them as much as you can hide what goes on in federal prisons. Now, state prisons and county jails are not under the Patriot Act. So you can go in with a camera, you can find out more, but when I was in the feds, there was no cameras allowed, just like in immigration centers. So what happens in federal prisons is very similar to what's happening in immigration centers. But if the people who work on feds don't talk to the people who work on immigrations, or there's not some crossover, then we're both working on the same thing, and everyone's learning curve is going to be identical. Nobody's learning curve gets shortened. And that's a problem. We don't want to we don't want to do, find people who do what you like and find out their networks. I just want to make one request. Before we leave, I work with Revolution Messaging, who are formerly Bernie Sanders' campaign, who did all his email, and they have accused me of having absolutely no action shots. I am not seen in any picture with any people. So if some of you will just talk to me and you can take some pictures, we can pretend it's an action shot after we're done, because they're going to kill me. They have shots of me at podiums, they have shots with me and other people, but they want shots of me pretending that it's an action shot. And go to my website. They did a great job. I will be here afterwards. I will stick around for, first of all, a couple of action shots, if a couple of you would come forward. And then I'm more than happy to talk to anybody. Thank you. Thank you. Come here, be in an action shot with me. Come on, some people.
Everybody, come on, get up
Come
here.
on.